Don't believe the headlines telling you tensions are cooling in the South China Sea. While Western media focuses on diplomatic statements and naval exercises, a far more dangerous mechanism just activated that could send oil to $450 per barrel within 90 days. And here's the part almost nobody is discussing. The United States doesn't have a single viable military option to stop it. On March 15, 2026, at exactly 3:47 a.m. Beijing time, Chinese maritime militia vessels established a coordinated blockade pattern across 3 critical choke points simultaneously. Not the Taiwan Strait that everyone watches, not the contested Spratly Islands, 3 underwater pipeline junction points, and 2 liquefied natural gas transfer stations that handle 2 million barrels of oil equivalent every single day. That's 8% of global energy throughput vanishing in a single coordinated action. The cost to establish this blockade? Approximately $890 million in vessel deployment, coordination systems, and logistical support. The cost to break it using conventional military force? The Pentagon's own internal assessment, leaked to defense analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, estimates $127 billion in the first 30 days alone. That's a cost asymmetry of 142 to 1. Let that sink in. But the deployment cost is almost routine by the standards of modern great power competition. What happened simultaneously 400 miles to the west at the exact same moment changes the entire calculus. That is the part of this story that almost no one is discussing, and it transforms this from a regional skirmish into a global economic crisis that will reshape everything about how we think about energy security and naval power projection. Chapter 1: The Geography of Energy Stranglehold. To understand what just happened, you need to see the South China Sea not as a political map with contested islands, but as a 3-dimensional energy infrastructure network worth $2 trillion annually. This isn't about rocks and reefs. This is about the most valuable maritime economic zone on the planet, and China just demonstrated it can turn off the flow in under 4 hours. Here's the mechanism most analysts missed. The South China Sea contains 7 major underwater pipeline networks connecting Southeast Asian production facilities to Northeast Asian consumption markets. 3 of these networks converge at junction points in international waters, but within what China claims as its 9-line territory. The Malampaya-Taiwan pipeline junction alone handles 7 million barrels per day of natural gas equivalent. The Indonesia-Japan crude corridor moves another 3 million barrels daily. The Vietnamese offshore platform network feeds 8 million barrels into regional distribution systems. Add it together and you get 2 million barrels of oil equivalent flowing through choke points that, until March 15th, we all assumed were protected by international law and freedom of navigation principles. China just demonstrated those assumptions were dangerously naive. The blockade vessels aren't military warships in the traditional sense. They're maritime militia ships, technically classified as civilian fishing vessels with reinforced hulls and coordination equipment. China deployed 187 of these vessels in a coordinated pattern that any petroleum engineer will immediately recognize as a textbook interdiction formation. They're not blocking physical passage of tankers. They're positioning themselves directly above pipeline infrastructure and LNG transfer points in a pattern that makes any transfer operation physically impossible without risking catastrophic damage to billion-dollar underwater systems. Think about what this means. A conventional naval blockade requires destroyers, submarines, air superiority, satellite coordination, and costs billions of dollars per week to maintain. China just achieved the same strategic effect using fishing boats that cost $8 million each to build and operate. The entire 187-vessel deployment represents less than $900 million in capital investment. The United States spent $28 billion on interceptor missiles in a single night defending against Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. China just blockaded 17. 8% of global energy flow for less than the cost of one night of American missile defense. According to analysis from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, one of the most respected nonpartisan economic research organizations, disruption of this magnitude in energy markets creates price shockwaves that compound exponentially. Their modeling, published in February 2026, projected that sustained disruption of 30 million barrels per day of oil equivalent would drive Brent crude to $380 to $450 per barrel within 60 to 90 days as strategic reserves deplete and panic buying overwhelms available supply. We're not talking about $380 oil as a theoretical scenario anymore. We're 34 days into this disruption, and Brent crude has already surged from $87 per barrel on March 14th to $214 per barrel as of April 18th. That's a 146% increase in 34 days. At this trajectory, we hit $380 by late May and $450 by mid-June. And here's what keeps me up at night. There is no historical precedent for unwinding this kind of price shock without either massive new supply coming online, which takes 18 to 24 months minimum, or demand destruction through economic collapse. Chapter 2. The American Checkmate Position. Now let's talk about why the United States cannot respond effectively using conventional military options. This is where the analysis gets uncomfortable, but the numbers are unequivocal. The U.S. Navy maintains approximately 11 aircraft carrier strike groups globally. 3 are currently deployed in the Pacific theater. Sounds impressive until you understand the operational geometry. To establish sea control over the South China Sea sufficient to guarantee safe energy transit operations, the Navy's own doctrine requires sustained air superiority, submarine dominance, and surface action group presence across 4 million square miles of ocean. That operational requirement demands a minimum of 7 carrier strike groups operating in coordinated fashion for a sustained period. The United States has never deployed 7 carrier strike groups to a single theater since World War II. The logistical, maintenance, and personnel rotation requirements make it physically impossible to sustain that level of deployment for more than 60 to 90 days before readiness across the entire global fleet degrades to dangerous levels. And that's before we factor in the cost. A single carrier strike group costs approximately $5 million per day to operate at peacetime tempo. Combat operations multiply that figure by a factor of 4 to 6, depending on intensity. So 7 carrier strike groups operating at combat tempo in the South China Sea would cost between $182 and $273 million per day. That's 5 to 8. $2 billion per month just to maintain presence. And we haven't fired a single weapon yet. Now factor in the defensive costs. China has deployed an estimated 2,400 anti-ship cruise missiles and 380 anti-ship ballistic missiles across its southern military region. These systems, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, can engage targets at ranges up to 930 miles from the Chinese coast. That means every single U.S. surface vessel operating in the South China Sea is within engagement range from the moment it enters the theater. Defending against this threat requires layered missile defense that consumes interceptors at a rate that quickly becomes economically unsustainable. Each SM-3 interceptor costs $28 million. Each SM-6 costs $3 million. A sustained campaign would require firing these interceptors at a rate of 40 to 60 per day just to maintain defensive coverage, based on threat modeling from the RAND Corporation's 2025 assessment of Pacific theater combat scenarios. That's $172 to $400 million per day in defensive expenditures alone before accounting for any offensive operations. Add it together, $182 to $273 million per day for operational presence, plus $172 to $400 million per day for defensive operations. We're looking at $354 to $673 million per day just to maintain a contested presence that doesn't guarantee freedom of navigation for energy shipments. Over 30 days, that's 10. 6 to 20. $2 billion. Over 90 days, 31. 8 to 60. $6 billion? And here's the truly devastating calculation. Even if the United States committed these resources, there is no guarantee of success. Maritime militia vessels operating in what China claims as territorial waters create an impossible targeting problem. They're not military combatants under international law. Engaging them risks escalation to direct U.S.-China conflict while simultaneously creating legal and diplomatic complications that fracture alliance structures. China doesn't need to win a military confrontation. It just needs to maintain the blockade long enough for energy prices to spike to levels that create economic crisis in consuming nations. At $450 per barrel oil, gasoline in the United States reaches $12 to $14 per gallon. Diesel for trucking and agriculture hits $15 to $17 per gallon. Heating oil in the Northeast becomes unaffordable for millions of households. Airlines ground 40 to 60% of flights. Manufacturing that depends on petrochemical feedstocks experiences cascading shutdowns. According to a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in January 2025, oil price shocks of this magnitude reduce GDP growth by 8 to 3 percentage points in advanced economies. The United States, with 2% projected growth for 2026, would enter immediate recession. Europe, already operating at 1% growth, would face contraction of 7 to 2%. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, all heavily dependent on South China Sea energy transit, would experience even more severe impacts. China absorbs the same energy price shock, but with a critical difference. 63% of China's energy consumption is domestically produced coal and renewable electricity. Only 37% is imported oil and gas, and China has been systematically building overland pipeline networks from Russia and Central Asia to reduce maritime dependency. The pain is asymmetric. China hurts. Its competitors collapse. Chapter 3. The money revelation. Now we get to the part that explains why this happened now and why it was inevitable, regardless of any particular political administration or diplomatic initiative. Follow the money, and the pattern becomes unmistakable. On March 1, 2026, 14 days before the blockade activation, the United States Treasury Department imposed what it called comprehensive secondary sanctions on Chinese financial institutions suspected of facilitating transactions with sanctioned Russian entities. The designation covered 23 Chinese banks, including 4 of the country's largest state-owned institutions. The immediate effect was to freeze approximately $347 billion in dollar-denominated assets and cut these institutions off from the SWIFT international payment system. The sanctions were presented as a measure to enforce compliance with Russia-related restrictions. But look at what happened in the 72 hours following the announcement. China's State Administration of Foreign Exchange reported a coordinated drawdown of U.S. Treasury holdings totaling $89 billion. Simultaneously, the People's Bank of China announced acceleration of the cross-border interbank payment system, China's alternative to SWIFT, with immediate onboarding of 47 additional international banks. Then, on March 8th, Saudi Arabia announced it would begin accepting payment in Chinese yuan for oil sales to China, a shift that represented $286 billion annually in transactions moving outside the dollar system. The United Arab Emirates followed 3 days later. Russia, already operating under Western sanctions, had been accepting yuan for energy sales since 2023. Add it together, and you get approximately $890 billion per year in energy transactions, shifting from dollar settlement to yuan settlement in a span of 2 weeks. Here's why this matters. The dollar's position as global reserve currency depends critically on its role as the settlement currency for energy transactions. This mechanism, established in the 1970s when Nixon secured Saudi agreement to price oil exclusively in dollars, creates structural demand for dollars that underpins the currency's value and allows the United States to run persistent trade deficits without the currency crises that would destroy any other nation's economy. When energy transactions move outside the dollar system, that structural demand begins to erode. It's not catastrophic immediately. The dollar won't collapse next week or next month, but the trajectory is clear and trajectories compound over time. Britain didn't lose the pound sterling status as global reserve currency in a single dramatic collapse. It lost it gradually over 3 decades as the system Britain had built outgrew the economic capacity Britain retained to sustain it. The same logic applies here. The United States doesn't need to experience hyperinflation or default for the dollar to lose reserve status. It just needs to become progressively less essential for critical global transactions. And energy is the most critical global transaction system that exists. China's blockade of South China Sea energy transit creates immediate price chaos, but it simultaneously accelerates the yuan-based energy trading system by creating urgency for Asian buyers to secure alternative payment mechanisms that bypass potential U.S. financial pressure. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan all hold massive dollar reserves and conduct trade primarily in dollars. But when their energy security is threatened by choke points that the United States cannot protect, the calculation changes rapidly. According to the International Monetary Fund's 2026 Global Financial Stability Report, published in April, central bank dollar reserve holdings have declined from 2% of global reserves in 2020 to 7% as of March 2026. That represents $8 trillion shifting out of dollar-denominated assets over 6 years. The pace is accelerating. In 2020, annual decline was 0. 3 percentage points. In 2025, it was 2 percentage points. If the current trajectory continues, dollar reserve share drops below 50% by 2029, crossing a psychological threshold that triggers additional diversification as central banks preemptively reduce exposure to perceived declining value assets. The South China Sea blockade is not primarily about Taiwan or territorial disputes or regional hegemony. It's about accelerating the timeline for dollar displacement by demonstrating that the United States cannot guarantee the security architecture that justifies dollar centrality. Think about what China is communicating to every Asian nation currently holding hundreds of billions in dollar reserves. Your energy security depends on supply lines we can interdict at will, and the United States cannot stop us without triggering economic catastrophe that harms you more than it harms us. Under these conditions, why maintain your savings in a currency system that cannot protect your core interests? Chapter 4, the historical parallel that explains everything. If this pattern feels familiar, it should. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends. In 1956, Britain and France, the dominant colonial powers of the previous century, attempted to reassert control over the Suez Canal after Egyptian nationalization. The operation was militarily successful in the narrow sense. British and French forces secured the canal zone within days. But the United States, refusing to support the operation and threatening financial pressure on the British pound, forced a humiliating withdrawal. The Suez Crisis didn't end British global power in a single moment, but it revealed the underlying reality that Britain's global position depended on American tolerance, not British capability. The pound sterling, already under pressure as global reserve currency, began its terminal decline. By 1967, the pound was devalued. By 1976, Britain required an IMF bailout. The currency that had dominated global trade for a century became a regional currency for a medium-sized European nation. The mechanism that destroyed British financial hegemony was not military defeat in conventional terms. It was the revelation that Britain could no longer guarantee the security of critical economic infrastructure that justified the pound's privileged position. Merchants and central banks holding pound reserves realized they were exposed to political decisions made in Washington rather than protected by British naval power. The diversification cascade followed inevitably. The South China Sea blockade is the 2026 equivalent of Suez 1956. The United States is discovering that its naval power, while substantial in absolute terms, is insufficient to guarantee security of energy infrastructure against a geographically proximate power willing to accept economic disruption as the price of strategic repositioning. And Asian nations holding dollar reserves are drawing the same conclusions that global merchants drew about the pound in 1956. The currency's value depends on guarantees the issuing power can no longer credibly provide. There's a second historical parallel worth examining. In 1973, Arab oil producers imposed an oil embargo against the United States and other nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. The embargo lasted only 5 months, but oil prices quadrupled from $3 per barrel to $12 per barrel. The resulting inflation and economic disruption contributed to the worst American recession since the Great Depression. The current situation is orders of magnitude more severe. The 1973 embargo affected approximately 14% of global oil supply. The South China Sea blockade affects 8% of global oil and gas combined in an economy far more dependent on continuous energy flow and far less able to quickly implement conservation measures. The United States in 1973 could implement fuel rationing, lower highway speed limits, and encourage carpooling. Those measures reduced consumption by approximately 7% within 6 months. The modern economy has no comparable elasticity. Logistics networks operate on just-in-time delivery systems with zero inventory buffers. Aviation fuel consumption cannot be reduced without grounding flights entirely. Petrochemical feedstocks for manufacturing have no short-term substitutes. The economy runs at optimized energy consumption with no slack capacity for rapid adjustment. If oil reaches $450 per barrel and sustains that level for 90 days, the economic impact dwarfs anything experienced in 1973. According to Oxford Economics analysis published in March 2026, sustained oil at $400 plus per barrel would reduce global GDP by $2 trillion over 12 months. That's 3% of global economic output vanishing due to energy price shock alone, before accounting for cascading effects through supply chains, employment, and financial markets. Chapter 5. China wins either way. Here's where the analysis becomes truly uncomfortable. China engineered a scenario where it benefits regardless of how the United States responds. If the United States commits massive military resources to breaking the blockade, it depletes its own financial capacity, reveals the vulnerability of forward-deployed naval assets to Chinese anti-ship systems, and potentially triggers direct military conflict that fragments alliance structures as European and Asian allies refuse to follow Washington into confrontation over energy transit routes that don't affect them equally. The cost of that military commitment, as we calculated earlier, runs between $30 and $60 billion over 90 days just to maintain contested presence. That's before accounting for potential losses of surface vessels, which would each represent $2 to $8 billion in replacement costs and years of reconstruction time. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the Navy's newest carrier, cost $3 billion to build. Losing a carrier in the South China Sea would be an economic catastrophe before it becomes a strategic catastrophe. But if the United States does not commit military resources, it reveals even more devastating strategic reality. American security guarantees are conditional, limited by geographic and economic constraints that hostile powers can exploit. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Southeast Asian nations would immediately begin diversifying security arrangements, accelerating the timeline for regional accommodation with Chinese preferences. The economic data already shows this shift beginning. In the 34 days since the blockade began, South Korea announced a $34.7 billion infrastructure development agreement with China, ostensibly unrelated to current tensions, but obviously calibrated as political signaling. Japan increased yuan reserve holdings by $12.3 billion, the largest single-month increase in history. Vietnam, which has territorial disputes with China in the South China Sea, announced it would join China's Belt and Road Initiative after years of resistance, a surrender masked as pragmatic engagement. China is systematically demonstrating that accommodation offers better outcomes than confrontation, and Asian nations are responding to incentives exactly as economic theory would predict. The United States offers military protection but cannot guarantee energy security. China threatens energy security but offers economic integration and yuan-based payment systems that reduce exposure to Western financial pressure. For nations dependent on imported energy and regional stability, the calculation becomes straightforward. According to the Asian Development Bank's Emergency Economic Assessment published April 12th, if the blockade continues through June, it will reduce Asian economic growth by 1 to 4 percentage points in 2026. That represents between $890 billion and $1.4 trillion in lost output across the region. But the costs are distributed asymmetrically. China experiences approximately 23% of the total impact despite representing 38% of regional GDP because of its greater energy self-sufficiency and alternative supply routes. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, all American security partners, absorb 61% of the total impact despite representing only 47% of regional GDP. The asymmetry is deliberate. China designed this crisis to inflict maximum pain on American allies while minimizing its own exposure, creating irresistible pressure for those allies to seek accommodation rather than continued dependence on American security architecture that cannot protect their core interests. Conclusion: the 450-barrel endgame. So where does this end? Let me give you the trajectories based on what we're seeing right now. Scenario 1, military escalation. The United States commits 7 carrier strike groups to the South China Sea and attempts to break the blockade through sustained military pressure. China responds by expanding the blockade to include Taiwan Strait transit and escalates to intermittent engagement of American vessels using anti-ship missiles, creating a limited shooting war that both sides claim to want to contain, but which spirals due to miscalculation and domestic political pressure. Oil hits $520 per barrel. Global recession turns into depression. The conflict ends through negotiated settlement after 4 to 7 months of devastating economic carnage, with China securing de facto control over South China Sea transit in exchange for lifting the blockade.